Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back to the second day of our Leadership Summit. So thrilled to have you here. For those of you who are new to the summit, just a reminder that we're glad that you joined us for this virtual one, but think about the future. We always offer leadership development programs. We offer some peer-to-peer or chapter exchange, as well as industry topics such as this today. And we're really looking forward to hearing about what's going on in our industry. Before I get to that, I'd like to say that yesterday was amazing. I hope for those of you who were able to join, really felt, even though it's not the same as being together, that you really felt like you got something out of it, both from a professional standpoint, as well as from the connections you have made at the leadership breakout meetings and or the networking hours. So thank you for joining us for those. It's a connection just the same. I'd also like to take a minute from the bottom of my heart to thank the Crew Network Board. Their leadership this year has been so instrumental. Their expertise, their insights, their knowledge. Our organization is in great hands with the thoughtful leaders we have. I'd especially like to thank Christine Gorham, our board president. She has been a grace and humor throughout all the challenges we've faced and come out shining and happy on the other side. And her optimism is infectious. To the other members of the executive committee, Tiffany English, our president-elect, and Holly Niebuhr, our immediate past president, you guys rock as an executive committee. You have been amazing this year. And the directors we've had on our board have provided great perspective and wisdom through every decision we've had to make, every new direction we'd have to take. And I really want to just call you out and just say, Adrienne Bain, Crew Charlotte, thank you. Kathy Carr, Crew Austin, thank you. Christine Chippernoy, Crew New York, thank you. Angie Earlywine, Crew St. Louis and Chicago, thank you. Molly Fadul, Crew Seattle, thank you. Jackie Orcutt, AZ Crew, thank you. And Karen Witt, Crew DC, thank you. You each bring your authentic self to our leadership, and I appreciate all you do to keep us moving forward. And to our members, you are what makes Crew great. Your engagement, your expertise, your willingness to support one another. Together, you strengthen and create a network that will advance women. I can stand here every day and do my job, but without you doing what you do in your chapters and in your work, we will not get this moving forward and be able to achieve our mission. So I just want you to know how honored I am to serve Crew Network and to partner with you to make change in our industry. And there's nothing more amazing to me as a human being and as a woman to watch our members grow and flourish as they participate and engage with Crew. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for your commitment and for being part of this amazing network. And with that, now, thank you. Now, let's get to this fantastic program. Spencer. Here we are, my friend.
Wendy.
We started out COVID together early in March, and here we are sort of starting to re-enter and come out someplace maybe normal, whatever that's going to look like.
Yeah.
So you and I and this whole group here with us, we started this dialogue way before anyone else. I'm gonna own that and take credit. You and I said, let's do this. Before we really understood the extent of what this was going to look like, because I do remember back in March us going, yeah, this is a good term. We're going to be back. So I'm really anxious to hear your brilliant perspectives today. Everyone, please join me in welcoming the always fascinating, engaging, and insightful Spencer Levy, who is chairman of the Americas Research and Senior Economic Advisor for CBRE. Welcome, Spencer.
Thank you, Wendy. So what I'd like to do today is speak for about 25, 30 minutes and then take questions. Because what I've been doing for the last several months has just been on nonstop calls like this. My first one, I think, was with you, Wendy, and I'm delighted that this one is too. But before I begin with my discussion, for those of you who don't know me, putting aside what I do for CBRE, you should know I'm a member of Crew. I'm not just a guest here. And I joined Crew for the right reasons, because in life, everybody needs a big break. And Crew gave me that break. I did a gig in San Antonio, Texas for your chapter there back, God, it could be 10 years ago. Just mute me. Oh, now I'm unmuted again. Somebody saw me speak, and your then president, Gail Ayers, was there, and she saw I did a pretty good job and got me some other gigs and changed the whole course of my career. So thank you, Crew, and when you call, I'll be there. So speaking about being there, let's talk about what's going on. And so the world right now has two major questions within commercial real estate. And the two major questions are, number one, optimism, and number two, the future of office. And I say on the second front, I've been out there slaying dragons for the last 3 months, because I got to tell you, there are a lot of people that are pretty negative on it. Well, I'll tell you what, I've gotten more criticism for my point of view on optimism than anything else, but I'm sticking to it. And why is that? So my comments will be broken into three categories: the macro, the micro, and then what I call the secular. And so from a macro standpoint, CBRE is in the optimistic camp, and I heard Wendy's opening comments. Apparently some of your members are as well. And you know what? Stick to it, because the facts on the ground lead us there. And why is that? Because I'm a real estate professional. And as a real estate professional, I really only trust one thing: comps, comparable transactions, comparable time periods. And then I read those tea leaves and I say, well, what do these tea leaves mean? And how do they form my opinion of when does this end and where do we go after that? Well, what helps form my opinion of where it ends and what does it look like after that is largely coming from Asia. I'm looking at what's happening in the facts on the ground in China right now. And notwithstanding the fact they had a flare up on Monday and they had to have a partial shutdown there, the Chinese economy is doing well. They're not back to full capacity, but close to it. Industry's all open, retail's open, every Starbucks is open. Now, people aren't traveling as much between cities. People are not doing as many major purchases, but they show a tremendous amount of pent-up demand. The demand for drive-to hotels is incredible, not just in China, but here in the U.S. Why am I sitting here with such a posh background behind me today? Because I am in the lovely Comfort Inn in Richmond, Virginia, driving down my son to his baseball tournament here. And this is not unusual. I did it last week in North Carolina and the week before that too. And I stayed in posh places like this, but I also went to the Greenbrier. So, I mean, it's not like I'm just going to these places. And by the way, they were full. Let me say that again. They were full. This hotel, I had to choose this one because the one I wanted to go to was full. What does that mean? What does full mean? Pent up demand. And that is what's going to make hotels bounce back. It's what's going to make restaurants bounce back. It's going to make the economy bounce back from a micro perspective. From a macro perspective, what's going to make it bounce back is the fact that we have unprecedented amounts of federal, monetary, and international stimulus that has raised the bottom. The bottom isn't nearly as bad as we thought it was or could have been. The bottom could have been abysmal. And in certain areas, it was really bad. The unemployment situation is awful, but not as bad as it could have been. The unemployment situation, a lot of people thought unemployment was going to peak at 25%. Then the jobs report came out 10 days ago, and it was a lot better than people thought. But let's talk about commercial real estate, because the same thing is happening there. So from a micro perspective, CBRE manages about 8,000 assets in the United States. And we track collections on a daily basis. And I will tell you that our collections have been better than expected across the board. And why is that? Because the Fed's PPP program and unemployment insurance raised the bottom. And raising the bottom means that the bottom could have been worse. So I'll give you some raw numbers. So our industrial collections are tracking at around 85%. Our multifamily collections are tracking at over 90%. Even our retail collections improved month over month, April to May, from about 56% to closer to 60%, which I know is a lot higher than some of the REITs that focus on the mall space. Now, the one area that does give me concern is office. Okay, gives me concern, though I'm still bullish on the future of office. I will tell you that we had a bad month over month comp in office collections. They fell from about 85% to about 80%. So it is the key question mark. Not that that's bad, because it's better than we expected, but nevertheless, what the market needs It's what's known as price discovery. People don't know what things are worth. People don't know what rents are. People don't know what or when to transact. And they will know that when we get to bottom. Okay. Well, here's the good news. I think we already got to bottom on industrial. I think we already got to bottom on retail. But we haven't gotten to bottom yet on office, which I think might be a month or two away. And we haven't gotten to bottom yet on multifamily, which might not be until November when a lot of the unemployment insurance runs out, which is supporting a lot of the multifamily rents. But then we can move forward. And moving forward looks like this. CBRE has broken our forecast into three categories. The one category, those assets that are going to come out after year one, that's industrial multifamily. The two category, which is office, which is where I'm going to spend most of my time today talking. And then the three category, which is retail and hotels, which are going to take longer. Now, within each of these categories, there are shades of gray by region. There are shades of gray by sub-asset type. So let me start with one big macro comment. Local politics matters more than national politics. This is something I've been saying forever. When it comes to commercial real estate, I'm not talking about other issues. I'm just talking commercial real estate. And the issues that we track very, very closely are issues like property taxes, which are now being called into question in cities that have fiscal problems. We look at things like rent control laws, which are now being imposed in places like New York and California. And yes, you now have to look at which states are more likely to open or close in the event of a flare-up of the disease. And that is something that is going to impact capital flows. And I can already tell you that the large institutional investors that I talk to, and I talk to them every day, they are all suggesting that a lot of their new capital flows may be going to places like the southeastern United States, like the Charlottes, the Atlantas, the Raleighs, the Nashvilles of the world, the Texases of the world, in part because of this lower taxes, ease of doing business. So those issues matter a lot from our perspective. I'm not saying federal issues don't matter. I'm saying the local issues matter more. But let's stick to the federal level for just a moment and what do we expect there. So as I suggested, the federal response to the pandemic has been imperfect, but it's been better than I had thought, a lot better. And that is what's raised the bottom. And so because of that, we are in the V-shaped recovery camp, right? Okay, every time I say that, I harken back, Wendy, to my Sesame Street days, because every letter in the alphabet, remember they had the character, the Count? Maybe he was the numbers guy. But anyway, they had the letter guy there too. So it's the V guy, the W guy, the U guy, the L guy. Well, we're the V guy. And we're the V guy because of this massive federal stimulus. And I think you see it most notably in the stock market and the positive jobs report from a few weeks ago. But going back to real estate, we are not in a V camp in real estate. We are in the Nike camp, the swoosh camp, the whatever shape you want to call it, but it's the 1, 2, 3 camp. But let's talk about the one camp first. So the one camp is multifamily and industrial. And industrial is going to be, if there's no such thing as a net winner in a pandemic, it's awful. But if there's any one asset class that will come out of this shining better than the rest, it's industrial. And it's industrial for two reasons. One, on a micro basis. If anything failed us during this pandemic, it was the fact that we were not resilient. We ran out of stuff. My wife and I, we order groceries every week from Peapod for the last 12 weeks. And every week for the last 12 weeks, the order comes in half full. Why? They ran out of stuff. So we need more capacity. There's been too much just-in-time delivery, so that will create more demand, not only for last mile industrial, but for cold storage. And where will that be? New facilities, or will that be the back of grocery stores? Wendy, here's a shameless plug. I can't help myself. I do a weekly podcast, and I did it this week. And my guest on this week's podcast was Barbara Emmons, our #1 industrial broker, and Fred Bowler, who's the CEO of Americold. And we talked about cold storage there. So industrial is a net winner in the long term. In fact, it's such a net winner that we have improved the forecast for industrial 2 years from now, even better than it was pre-pandemic. And that's before you start talking about the potential for reshoring of a manufacturing. And I would note, I spoke to a member of the President's Committee to reopen the government on Wednesday. And it is squarely on their mind to create more incentives for companies that have international manufacturing to bring it here. So that's a real thing. That's going to happen. And it will help industrial over the long term. But not all industrial is cut from the same cloth, because you have large industrial, which is the big box warehouse distribution. Then you have small bay industrial, which is flex industrial. And flex industrial is not going to do as well. And the collections there are not as good because a lot of those occupants there are not dissimilar to like bowling alleys. Everybody on this call who has a child or a grandchild has been to a jump house. Guess where those jump houses are? They're in flex industrial. They aren't opening anytime soon. So for the next 12 to 18 months, they're going to need to make accommodations there. Now, multifamily is probably 1 and 1A in terms of who's going to do well post-pandemic. It's doing well during the pandemic, as we've noted by collections, but we think that multifamily rents will suffer in 2020, probably down 7-8%. We'll start to bounce back, though, in the first quarter of 2021, both in terms of better vacancy and better rents. But now there are some subcategories of multifamily, though, that are not doing as well. Senior housing, student housing. What is the future of co-living? The bottom line is those areas are going to suffer for the next 12 to 18 months. But I think that the long-term megatrends are very positive in those areas, even senior housing, which tragically has faced the brunt of the disease. But nevertheless, very bullish on multifamily over the long term. Now, the number 2 category, what's going to bounce back in year 2, is office. And I could spend the next 6 hours on office, but I'll just spend the next 6 minutes. And office is the sector where you're seeing all the negative headlines out there from the CEOs from Morgan Stanley to Twitter to other companies. My employees never need to go back to the office. Not so fast. You got to remember why people go to the office. Here's the earmuffs moment for my office friends, but then take off your earmuffs because you're going to like what I'm going to say next. For the last 10 years, people didn't need to go to the office. People wanted to go to the office. And those want factors ain't going to change. And what are those want factors? It helps you attract and retain talent. It makes you happier. It makes you more productive. And this is the most important reason of all. It helps you develop the soft skills you need to get ahead in your career, especially communication and relationships and culture. And I'll tell you, this Zoom call is pretty good, but it's a whole lot better in person, Wendy. I'll tell you that. And I hope the next time you have one of those big gigs, you bring me there. Because I'll tell you what, I want to go back to the office. Listen, folks, you don't need to go to a restaurant either, do you? But you want to go. Same thing. Now, there are some short-term changes. The next 12 to 18 months are going to be tough in office. And they're going to be tough, particularly in big cities. Why? Mass transportation. People are afraid to get on trains, number 1. Number 2, people can't get in elevators. I spoke to my colleague in San Francisco the other day, and they were telling me that if they had to follow California social distancing guidelines, and they wanted to get every person into Salesforce Tower, 1.5 miles long, and by the time they got into the building, they'd all have to leave for the day. So it ain't going to work in tall buildings in the short term. And so because of that, what you're going to see is a little bit of a acceleration of a trend. And that's the word everybody's using now, acceleration of trend. And that's called the hub and spoke trend. We're going to have these big companies in the middle of cities where they're going to create satellite offices in suburbs. And I know this as a fact. This is not just opinion guy, because I speak to my brokers in the suburbs of New York, of Boston, of these big cities. And we're seeing a material rise in what we call TIMs, tenants in market, which are large companies from the cities that are taking 1 to 3 year leases in these areas. They like pre-built space. And yes, here it is, co-working space. You know, if anything hasn't been thrown under the bus during this crisis, it was co-working space. Well, guess what? This guy ain't going to throw it under the bus, because this guy thinks the future of co-working is bright. We believe in the rise of co-working, the agile workplace, the fluid workplace. As a matter of fact, shameless plug number 2, CBRE wrote a report on that called The Age of Responsive Real Estate, the 2030 report, which talked about the rise of the fluid workplace. And what it meant is, going right back to what I said, people don't need to go to the office. They want to go, and they're going to work from multiple environments, from their homes, from the back of a Starbucks, one day when self-driving cars come around, from the back of those cars. And that's a good thing. Flexibility is a good thing, but most people are going to go back to the traditional office environment, but you are going to have this hub and spoke type model. And a lot of those spokes are going to be co-working space. Now, space itself is going to change. Now, it's going to change less than you think, but there are some changes that you're already aware of. One, there's probably going to be less density. Second, there's going to be more cleanliness. And what does more cleanliness mean? You're going to take the janitorial services, which were traditionally a back of the house function, and bring it to the front of the house. I walked into this lovely little Comfort Inn here in Richmond, Virginia yesterday, and in the front of the house were guys with hoses and ammonia and bleach, and I don't know what they were doing, but they might have been doing nothing, but it made me more comfortable that they were doing it, and they're going to do that in your office building too. But the other things that they're going to do is they are going to improve your HVAC system. Now, HVAC systems, there's one basic type of system that most buildings use, which is known as forced air, which is the air coming through the vents. Most of you have that in your houses as well. Well, what are they going to do with the air coming through if you're breathing the air with the guy in the office next to you? I'll tell you what they're going to do. They're going to zap it with ultraviolet light so you feel safe. But there's another thing that they can do. They can create what's known as hydronic HVAC. I have a large client in Southern California named McCarthy Cook that is building a $500 million office building right now in West Hollywood, and they're putting in hydronic HVAC. And what is hydronic? It's when you pipe hot and cold water into your walls and into your floors without pumping air into it. Well, why don't people use more hydronic? Well, guess what? It's more expensive. But you know what? You're going to make people a whole lot more comfortable, and you're going to get the best tenants in the market if you spend that cost. But here's the rub, folks. There's a little give and take here. It's not just money. It's what happens to sustainability, green efforts, if wellness efforts get more important. Well, I think they can work hand in hand, but there are some areas that conflict. So I had the global head of real estate of Microsoft on my podcast 2 weeks ago, and we talked about the plastic spoons that Microsoft uses in its cafeterias. Not very green, but guess what? You're going to have to use them in the short term. I'll give you one other thing. Wendy, this is the point where you throw me off the call because I have 2 audience participation questions. You ready? Who here wants to get on a cruise ship again? I do. I'm alone, but I'm going to ask the second question. I'll get back to the cruise ship in a second. Who here would rather be in a building with operable windows that you can open versus not? Who here wants windows that you could open? All right, more hands. I see more hands. Well, here's the problem, folks who just raised your hands for question number 2. If you want to be LEED Gold certified or have an Energy Star rating, you cannot have operable windows in your buildings. And anybody know why buildings have revolving doors in the front? And it's not just because when you bring your kids to the building, they have fun zipping around them. It keeps the air in. Guess what? Those doors are going to be open. So wellness and sustainability need to find the happy medium so that one does not sacrifice the other. But these are some of the cuspy areas that we're thinking about. But do we think there's more people are going to work from home 2 years from now versus today? We do. Yeah. 10%, around that. Not the 40, 50% numbers that you're hearing right now. And you will see an acceleration of another trend, which I've talked about on these calls before, which is new is the new. What does that mean? The most modern buildings are going to have a big competitive advantage over older buildings. That was already a trend that was happening prior to this, and that trend is now accelerated. So the future of office is bright. You're going to see some of these changes, but it's going to go forward just fine. Now, the last 2 categories are retail and hotels. And as I said, I'm staying in the posh Comfort Inn right now in Richmond, Virginia. They're cleaning it fine. The future of drive-to hotels like this guy are just fine. The challenges are going to be in the international hotels and the business traveler hotels. So there's a study I read recently which tried to rank the most resilient and the least resilient markets to the COVID crisis. The most resilient market happened to be the Princeton, New Jersey to Trenton corridor. Why? Lots of healthcare, lots of education, a lot of biotech right there. The least resilient market, Honolulu. Shocking. Hard to drive to Honolulu from California, isn't it? And so these are the kind of markets that are going to take longer to get back, and the assets that are in those markets are going to take longer, but people will go back. Now, Wendy, I'm going back to my cruise ship comment again. You know what's awesome? Cruising. You know what's more awesome than cruising? Cruising for free. And now I'm going to quote an old 1980s movie. Wall Street, where they had this expression, greed is good, greed works. I'm not saying that greed is good, but I'm telling you that greed works. Because if they price your cruise ship down to zero, that thing is going to be packed tomorrow, just like your hotel, just like retail. It is economics 101. People can buy market share, and people will go back on the cruise ships, believe it or not. But people in the short term are going to go to these drive-to hotels. The business center and the international hotels are going to suffer in the short term. The last one is retail. And once again, when we talk about acceleration of trend, the acceleration of trends in retail are obvious. A lot of department stores are getting hit. A lot of secondary market malls are getting hit. But you already knew that. It's just business. It just was accelerated. And there will be some redevelopment of these places into more live, work, play environments. But the new trend is people can't go to restaurants, bowling alleys, gyms. Well, people are going to go back. As soon as the doors are open, people will go back. But in the short term, in the next 12 to 18 months, they're going to suffer. And landlords and tenants are going to have to figure out how to work it out because tenants can't pay full rent. And then landlords are going to have to figure out what do they do with their lenders. I guess the good news I would have had on this call 6 weeks ago is that we had a kumbaya spirit among lenders, landlords, and tenants. I got bad news. That's changed now. It's gotten much more litigious. The last month, the tide has turned from we love you to pay me. And I think we're going to see a very messy process in the next few months when the courts open up again on how they're going to litigate this. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. Even though Washington may seem like the most fractured place on the planet, there is a bit of a kumbaya spirit there with respect to the economy. And the reason for that is there are no villains in this particular pandemic. That Wall Street didn't do it, tech didn't do it, so they are prepared to put additional support in. When I had a conversation with this gentleman who was on the President's Committee on Wednesday, we talked about additional support and what's coming. And my advice was to keep the foot on the gas, put as much in as possible. Now, don't worry about the deficits. Don't worry about inflation because certain types of businesses, in particular, retail and hotels need it desperately, and increasingly, office needs it for liquidity because the banks have gotten much tougher in terms of underwriting. We'll see what happens, but right now there's a push and pull between the inflation hawks who don't want more support and the people on the ground says we need it or there's going to be some real challenges in the business. I expect more support for our industry. So let me sum up my comments like this, Wendy, and then we can do Q&A. I am in the optimist camp, have been in the optimist camp for the last 3 months, and doggone it, I'm sticking to it. Because the facts on the ground have borne out what we saw from a macro perspective in terms of federal support. From a macro perspective, that what we saw in China was achievable to a great degree here. And the commercial real estate industry will bounce back as well. The bottom here won't be nearly as far down because of PPP, won't be nearly as bad as the GFC. And 18 months from now, life will be a lot more normal than you think it will be. And we'll have some changes in the wellness that will make us better off over the long term. So with that, Wendy, thank you for having me here. I love CRE, and I'll take whatever questions you got.
Thanks, Spencer. I've just posted a note in the chat. If you can just post your questions in the chat box, I will pose them to Spencer. Spencer, thank you. As always, it's just a delight to have you with us, and you make it fun and interesting at the same time. And by the way, I feel like I just need to acknowledge your shameless plugs. I get it. And actually, someone wants to know the name of your podcast. So can you share that with the group?
It is The Weekly Take.
The
Weekly Take. And we are on episode 14 now, 13, 14. Please join. It's on CBRE website. A lot of great guests, and I'm sure some of the folks on this call would be great guests too.
Okay. Let's get to some questions I have here. It's filling up my my chat box. So let me start up at the top and just say, let's see here. Our first question would be, besides the podcast one, here we go. Do you see any opportunity for landlord protections with lenders upstream from PPP protections for small business? Do you see any, go ahead.
Yes. Okay, I had this precise conversation on Wednesday. And so the asset class that is by far in the best position from a federal perspective, from a lender perspective, is multifamily. And why is that? Because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have given great guidance on how to give forbearance, meaning you don't have to pay your loans to landlords, and by extension, tenants don't have to pay their rent if they're in financial difficulties. I've asked for the exact same protection for all the other asset classes. I asked for it on TV. I asked for it to the president's guy. And now there's people lobbying exactly for that. So I'll give you the short term, then I'll give you the long term. The short term is the regulators have been incredibly accommodating for certain types of lenders. So I have a client of mine, a big German bank, who I spoke to 2 days ago, and they have an $8 billion loan book here in the United States. And $5 billion of their loans are in hotels and in malls. Needless to say, they've had a busy few months here, right? But what did they do? They gave covenant relief, meaning you don't have to hit your financial targets till the end of 2021. And who gave them that ability? The European Central Bank. FDIC hasn't given quite as much liberty. Insurance companies are regulated on a state-by-state basis, so it's a little bit of a hodgepodge, but I expect a lot of relief there. The area that's obviously most challenged are conduit loans, CMBS loans, because they don't have any legal ability to do it. So what we've asked for is a new liquidity facility from the government to either directly fund those loans or a place that they could take out those loans using new capital from the government. So the long story short is, for the questioners, the question that was asked is that many landlords have flexibility, but it depends upon their type of lender. The best flexibility you can get, everybody that's in the retail and the hotel space, I've recommended that you get covenant relief through the end of next year, but we expect additional liquidity to be coming, and that's being talked about now.
Thanks, Spencer. Next question, what is the timing of recovery looking like for healthcare systems?
Well, it's a funny story. I guess it's not a funny story, but it's a tragic story in many ways, because people thought that the area that would be most defensive in a pandemic would be healthcare, right? No, because I think you have to separate the two things. You have to separate the response to the pandemic and then everything else these healthcare systems do. The pandemic stuff, after a very rocky start, got ramped up and is actually going relatively smoothly now. The other stuff was shut down. My wife owns a physical therapy practice in Maryland. It was shut down along with the rest of her medical office building. So I would say that the healthcare systems are going to take a while to recover. I would say that once the social distancing restrictions are off, they'll bounce back sooner than most. Probably by the end of this year, they'll operate fairly normally. So I would say a fairly quick recovery, but by no means without its challenges, particularly in those areas where we see a flare-up in the pandemic, where some of those, quote, non-essential medical services will be shut down too.
Okay, thank you. So what are your thoughts on the timing of opening the Canadian-US border and the impact on trade?
Well, I think the travel restrictions can and should be done under the advice of medical professionals. And I'm going to just start saying I am not a medical professional. I'm a real estate professional. But at the same time, I think it's going to happen soon because there's tremendous economic pressure behind it, number one. And number two, the disease is getting a little bit better controlled. So I think there are ways that we can do it. But it's going to be slow. I think the state-to-state travel is happening right now. I'm Exhibit A. I think international travel between Canada, U.S., and Mexico, I see that opening up again by Labor Day. Certainly from a trade perspective with significant restrictions, maybe a little bit later than that. The risk factor is the so-called double dip in the fall. If we see that, are they going to shut it down again? I don't know, but I believe that post-Labor Day, you're going to see some of those restrictions drop.
Thanks, Spencer. With unemployment high and PPP forgiveness commencing, why do you expect multifamily to bounce back so quickly?
Well, a couple things. One of the challenges for multifamily is, and let me say when we get to bottom, I keep using this example, where is the bottom? Multifamily's bottom is not going to happen until October or November because that's when unemployment insurance falls off. So actually, the collections are probably going to drop a little bit in November. But nevertheless, we think multifamily is going to bounce back quickly for a lot of the reasons that were helping multifamily pre-COVID, which is the gig economy, people's preference for renting over buying, and the unfortunate, I don't want to get too much on my soapbox here, the unfortunate reality of higher education. People are coming out of these schools saddled with so much student debt, they can't afford a down payment. And so all of those mega trends are only going to get worse, tragically in many cases, post-pandemic, which is going to allow multifamily to bounce back sooner. Another thing that's going to happen is you're going to see less construction, certainly in the intermediate term. And so because of that, existing stock will get more valuable.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go, whoops. Let's see here. Oh, this is a long question, so I'm going to read slow. On the topic of wellness and energy-rated office buildings, for markets that have challenges with traffic and air pollution, what are your thoughts on a coordinated effort by large corporations to require work from home and coordinated travel to work days to ease traffic and pollution?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if that caller's calling in from Los Angeles, a market that's notoriously challenged by both traffic, pollution, what we used to call in the 1970s smog. I haven't heard that term smog in a while. I don't know why not. That's a combination of smoke and fog. Yeah. So look, to me, and this is also in my shameless plug 2030 report, the most inefficient thing that any human being does is commute to and from work. It is, if anywhere from, an hour to 3 hours a day. My dad, when he was commuting to the office, he lived in South Salem, New York, and commuted to Manhattan. It took him an hour and a half each way. And he was cool with that. I'm like, wow, times have changed, man. But so I definitely see a change to commuting patterns, but this goes right back to what I was saying before, the hub and spoke. I think the hub and spoke is the future, where you're going to see a lot of people that are going to have their offices in the CBD, and they're going to people have offices in the suburbs, and it's going to change depending upon your life stage. Listen, I got 3 kids. I work at home on Fridays. I never see them otherwise. And so, and it's not making me less efficient. It's also making me a little bit more happy. So I would definitely see an effort to try to reduce traffic, to help pollution. But as far as a coordinated effort among corporations, there are some efforts underway. So the Business Roundtable has come out with several pronouncements about thinking about your stakeholders, not just your shareholders. And the stakeholders are the community as defined by a lot of different categories. So yeah, I think you're going to see the Business Roundtable come out with some things on that. And I would hope it would happen organically rather than from a regulatory standpoint. Because I think if it does happen from a regulatory standpoint, it's going to happen at the local level, and it's going to really hurt those localities that have it, even if they have the best intentions, because many companies will go elsewhere.
So on that topic, with the trend we saw, over the last several years is companies relocating to where the population for employees was,
Yeah.
Where are the people that are going to work in our companies? Do you think that will be affected by this as well? Because if companies, and I can think of some in Arizona, companies that have relocated there to Dallas. It was all driven by where are the people that are going to work for these companies, and where are they going to get the workforce? Do you see that continuing to impact with this as well?
Yes, and again, it goes into that category, acceleration of trend, which is my new favorite expression. Absolutely was accelerated because of this. And technology has helped accelerate too, because even though the Zoom call is not as good as the office, it's pretty good. And people can work remotely more efficiently, effectively than you can. So look, I was just on the phone, I'm telling you, an hour ago with one of the biggest investors in the world. And they were all about the big picture mega trends of demographic shifts. It's interesting when you speak to some of the most sophisticated investors in the world. They're some of the simplest thinkers in the world. They actually think very, very simply. They say the only factor that really matters is demographics, which is where are population shifting, where are you getting the best talent? And if that's in New York, great. If that's in Raleigh, North Carolina, great. If that's by Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, great. absolutely the trend was accelerated. And the question is, what will that do to demand in some of those markets that are left behind?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's go on. This is a great question. And thanks, Susanna, for posting this. Any thoughts on how this, what's happening, COVID and the work situation, is affecting women in the workforce? As noted, women have stepped up to be caregivers for their children, sometimes some teaching and working. And how do you see a companies addressing this, or do you, moving forward?
Yeah, well, the issue of women in the workforce, I think, came to a head, many times throughout history. But this is yet another one. This is a watershed moment, because when things got bad and people had caregiving for their kids, a disproportionate number of those caregivers were women. And so, are we going to see a trend where women are going to be allowed to work more from the home rather than into the office for caregiving? Or, and here's where there needs to be a real conversation, goes right back to what I said before. Is that going to hurt women from a promotion standpoint long term? That is the key question, and we can't duck it. That FaceTime matters in the office, but how do you balance that with childcare? Do you have more childcare in the office or otherwise? These are difficult questions, Wendy. They have not changed because of COVID-19, but I think the good news about COVID-19, they're now front burner. They're front burner stuff, and I would certainly hope to find ways that whatever changes do happen to benefit work from homers don't come at the burden of losing those promotion opportunities, from picking up those soft skills. In fact, here's not a shameless plug, but this is a study that I've read carefully. There's a terrific study that came out from Stanford University in 2015, which I'm happy to send you, which talks about the implications of work from home on things like promotions. And Wendy, you got no friend like me. I'm straight up, and I want women to succeed badly. But we need to talk about these issues in a way that says, okay, is more work from home a good thing, or is it a bad thing, and what are the costs and benefits? That's sort of what I'm saying.
Well, and part of that, if I may, is just the mindset of the leadership. Mm-hmm. To just think differently about what they need in terms of face time, in terms of obligation. I mean, I'm just saying that there are a lot of CEOs who are on the older side, more seasoned, that still have the command and control and 80s, 90s kind of mentality. We're not in that world anymore. So I'll stop there.
Well, I agree. I think that there's been look, I'm going to go right to it. I think a lot of the social unrest we're seeing in the U.S. today, the tragedies that preceded it, are also going to accelerate positive change.
Great.
So I think the COVID crisis, the social unrest tragedies that are occurring in America today, will accelerate positive change. But ultimately, I think it has to be done in a very calculated way. I think you have to take a look at, be careful what you wish for. Don't wish for just more work from home. It can't come at the sacrifice of these soft skills and the promotion opportunities.
Agree. Okay, let's go on. I have a lot of questions left to get to. Nashville just raised property taxes 34% to make up for deficits from lack of tourism and giving incoming companies tax breaks to move here. Do you have any guesses on how that will affect the move to this Southeast city and other cities that raise property taxes?
I've gone to a lot of cool corporate events in my time, but maybe the coolest corporate event I went to was for a client of mine, Zurich Financial. And we went to Nashville and we did karaoke, and there was some person in the organization who did a version of Prince's When Doves Cry that I'm telling you is the single greatest corporate performance in the history of corporatedom. That ain't going to change. Nashville is awesome. Austin, Texas is awesome. Why is that? Because we believe more strongly in one trend than anything else. Live, work, play. You cannot replicate that. Even if it becomes in the short term a little bit more expensive, it's still a hell of a lot cheaper than it is almost any place else. Yeah. And so you have to look at it not on an absolute basis, but on a relative basis. So Nashville's still going to be cheaper. And they still have this live, work, play environment that's going to be a tremendous attractor to both permanent businesses and to short-term businesses. So look, a friend of mine is a guy by the name of Fritz Kagi. Fritz is the chief tax assessor for Cook County, which is Chicago. And, we talk about this. This is a real issue. It's a real issue in Chicago. It's a real issue in California, where they were talking about a so-called split roll tax. We're going to split commercial from residential. And by the way, everybody in commercial is a greedy landlord Wall Street type, right? Wrong. But that's how the world sees it. And so because of that, if they're going to try to get an incremental dollar, it's always going to go to commercial. It's not going to go to single family residential. So it's an issue. It's not as much of an issue for Nashville as is for some of these other old school cities that are really burdened fiscally, really burdened from a pension fund standpoint. So I wouldn't worry too much about it in Nashville, but in some of those other cities, they have a greater challenge.
Thank you for that. I echo your love of Nashville. Oh, here's one. So what about when you may have answered this, what about when PPP money runs out? Do you think that the positive news on rent collection is related to that, and that we will see a downturn when money runs out?
Well, I want to describe the government's policy in 2 words: pause button. They were trying to hit the pause button until people got back on their feet and can go without them. I sure hope the pause button worked, but there's a risk factor that it didn't, and it's certainly going to be there are going to be casualties on the field. It's terrible. I mean, there are up to 20% of restaurants will never reopen. There are going to be more bankruptcies, other businesses, careers altered. It's going to be a disaster. But the good news is that the government did more than was humanly ever done before and did a good job. And I think they will do more. But to the questioner's to the caller's question, yes, there will be casualties post PPP. But depending upon the depth and the breadth of that, there may be additional government intervention. But there were also this one thing sitting out there that nobody's talked about at length, which are the bankruptcy judges. The bankruptcy judges in this environment, they're not going to be too friendly to somebody who's trying to squeeze a small company. They're not. And so some mom and pop company walks into a bankruptcy court, they're going to get as much accommodation as possible. So the long story short, it's going to be bad. It's going to be ugly, but it's not going to be as bad or as ugly as it could have been without the government support. And I do expect more.
Thank you. I've noticed I'm here in Lawrence, Kansas, where Crew Network is headquartered, as many of you know, and I've seen a lot of empty storefronts. And by the way, my favorite wine store has closed, which really got me right where it hurts.
Wendy, I'll make that up to you. Next time I see you, I'm buying you a big glass of Chardonnay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, make that rosé and I'll buy you the Manhattan, right? That's our
Thank
deal.
you. Done.
This is from the Boston area. Can you share some magnitude on the hub and spoke on urban versus suburban locations? She says, I heard that Boston/Cambridge will see 1 to 2 million square feet go under sublease and look to move that footage to satellite suburban offices.
In the history of real estate, there has never been a better market than Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yeah. Cambridge, Massachusetts was so good until 3 months ago. They had negative vacancy. I had never seen that before. You know what negative vacancy is? There were people lining up. So there may be some short-term softness in Cambridge. And by the way, there's going to be some short-term softness in San Francisco too. I know that as a fact. I watch the sublease statistics from my colleagues almost every day. It comes across my screen. It's like a slot machine. So do I see those jobs permanently shifting out to the suburbs? I see hub and spoke more of that. But I think that the core of those companies, 80, 90% of employees are still going to work in Cambridge. But this goes right back to that question you asked me before, Wendy. What do you do if you say, I want to go work in one of these spokes? Does that hurt me from a promotion standpoint? Does that hurt me from a soft skills standpoint? I hate talking about those questions, but I'm glad I'm talking about those questions because we have to talk about those questions. Because if you don't, it comes from the files of be careful what you wish for. Don't let the convenience factor overwhelm these other factors, or at least do so with your eyes open, and we can try to deal with them in a way that mitigates their impact.
Okay. What do you think the liquidity market is going to look like for the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, that was yet another topic I talked about with the president's committee member on Wednesday. And in multifamily, very good to very good. In industrial, okay. I say okay because it's good for stabilized existing, but unless you are the biggest kid on the block, you're not getting a construction loan for spec industrial construction right now. And then from there, it gets progressively worse. It's getting much more challenging to do stabilized office. It's impossible to do spec office right now. And retail and hotels aren't even in the conversation. We need significant, real, massive liquidity mechanisms now, or you're going to see a rash of bankruptcies in retail and hotels and increasingly in office. And so that is what we're asking for. I can send you several proposals that are out there for what that liquidity mechanism looks like. But in the absence of that, I'm concerned because even some of the big money center banks are not lending right now, except to their best relationships. And so the traditional liquidity environment is going to be materially constrained through the end of 2020 in the absence of a new vehicle. So that's my short answer.
That was short? Just kidding. Here's a great question. Can you speak to the CRE distress cycle? Will banks be inclined to extend or pretend in hopes that they won't need to foreclose? And when do you think the opportunistic investors will see assets on the block?
I get that question every single day.
Great question, I know, yeah.
And so there's a long debate I have in my company over when these distressed opportunities will come. I was on the call with one of the biggest investors in the world this morning talking about this very question. And my answer is not when, if. I use the if word because it depends upon the scope of the government intervention. The government intervention is this X factor that did not exist in the RTC days in the early 1990s. It did not exist with this level of force during the global financial crisis. So if government intervention comes in, it's going to keep kicking that can down the road, potentially the beginning of 2022, and you're never going to see massive intervention. Notwithstanding that, even if the government intervention comes in as good as it could reasonably come in, you're still going to see a lot of casualties on the side of the road. And that will probably start happening late in the fourth quarter this year into next year. And many of those casualties won't be in the form of distressed sales. They'll be in the form of distressed refinancings where people can't refinance their loan. So they got to go to a harder money lender, or they need to get a slab of preferred equity or mezz into their capital stack. So by the end of this year, you'll start to see them. But the X factor is, will we see another dose of massive government intervention in the form of one of these liquidity mechanisms that I've asked for before? If we get one of those, you're going to see less. If we don't, you're going to see more.
Great, thank you. That is interesting. So I'm skipping around because there's some questions I think are really important, like big picture. Can you speak to the volatility of the stock market and how that will play into recovery? A couple of people have said that's a great question. Why is the stock market so disconnected from the realities of our current economy and unemployment?
Well, you should know that both Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke and I have nothing in common except one. We all believe that the stock market is the single most important indicator of both consumer and business sentiment. It may be this disjointed thing out there, unfair, Wall Street versus man. Use whatever you want. But everybody on this phone call has got a 401k account, and you don't have a pension plan that's going to pay you out in the future. And it creates what's known as the wealth effect. You feel wealthier even if you don't need to tap your 401k for 20 years. If your 401k is a little bit higher, you're more likely to spend that incremental dollar on something else. So notwithstanding the disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street, the stock market, for better or for worse, we're stuck with it, live with it, and hope that it goes up, because if it doesn't, it impacts everybody. Now, on the Main Street versus Wall Street, I'm going to give you a slightly different question on this. I was on a phone call this morning with one of these guys in New York, and we were talking about where I was. And I was like, yeah, I've been traveling back and forth to North Carolina the last 3 weeks. And he was really worried about me. I'm not saying like, good luck, Spence. It was, don't do it, Spence. There's a real fear factor out there, and I want to be respectful of that. But I would suggest to you that real fear factor is actually much bigger in New York, in Boston, in San Francisco, and LA than it is elsewhere in the country. In the rest of the country, people are ready to move forward. They're ready to open the doors. And I don't want to be disrespectful to people who've had direct experience with the disease because it's awful. But the Main Street disconnect is twofold. One is the fear factor, which I think is different based upon the region of the country you're in. The other disconnect is people can't see the long term if their company's about to go bust in the next 30 days because they got no revenues. I have the luxury of being able to see the big picture because I see the federal stimulus dollars. I see their impact elsewhere. So it's very common in economic downturns for there to be a split of opinion between the economists that live in our ivory towers on 30,000 feet and people at the ground level, at Main Street level. But we can see that things are going to get better faster than they think, and we've already seen objective evidence of that in the form of the jobs report.
Mm-hmm. Tied to that comment that you made, and this the difference in how people are experiencing or coming out of this. Someone else had asked the question: is do you think that people are going to tolerate another shutdown here in the U.S. or even in Canada? I think things are still even more restricted in Canada. They're not nearly in the phase we are in reentry. Do you think people will tolerate another shutdown if there's a recurrence?
Once again, this came up on my call on Wednesday with the president's guy. Short answer is the tolerance level is getting lower and lower. But you will see regional shutdowns from time to time when there's a flare-up, much like we just saw in Beijing. Beijing had a flare-up on Monday or late last week into this week. They shut down segments of the economy, and that's a good thing. I hope we see that. I hope we see regionalized shutdowns where necessary. This one-size-fits-all, everybody's in the same boat thing, I think speaks for itself. It was a little bit too heavy-handed across the board. I'll give you one example of that. This is so minor, I'm almost embarrassed to bring it up, but I'll bring it up. Last week, I drove to bring my kid to a baseball tournament in North Carolina, which was played in a minor league ballpark for a real minor league team, 3,000 seats. I wasn't allowed in. And I had to watch the game from over the center field fence, crammed with a bunch of other parents. Okay? So trust me is not the worst strategy in the world. Just tell everybody to wear masks and we'll move forward. So I think there are better ways to do it, but regionalized shutdowns are okay from time to time and more common sense approach. But a massive shutdown again, I don't see it.
Can you turn your phone off? Thanks. Hey, two questions on the study. One was the 2015 study by Stanford. Is that correct? It was a study on the impact of promotions on remote working. So someone had asked. It was
a work from home study on a Chinese company, the largest travel agency in China. It's a terrific study. You should read it because the surface of it, if you read just the surface, you reach the conclusion that work from home is great. But when you really dig into it, you say, wait a minute. What does this do to people who work from home? Mm-hmm. And that was one of the casualties was the promotions. I'll send after this, Wendy. I'll send you a link to my weekly take, my 2030 report, that Stanford report, and I'm happy to discuss it further. But that is the elephant sitting in the corner of the room right now. It might be more convenient for 100 things to work from home, but man, it better not kill you for these other factors.
And I'm going to add to the list the hub and spoke report.
We don't have a report on hub and spoke. Okay. That is just the facts on the ground as we're seeing it based on our conversations. But nevertheless, we've done surveys on that. I'll find those.
Okay, thank you, and I'll remind you. Let's see. Another question here. I have been in office. Oh no, that's not a question. Question. Okay, here, regarding Spencer's comment around where populations are shifting, if there will be more hub and spoke type office setups, will the demographics in the long run continue to shift? In other words, people won't move to particular markets for jobs. There actually may be out migration to less popular areas with great Wi-Fi.
Well, I think you're going to see population shifts to places where people have a better life overall. And a better life overall isn't just the best career opportunities. I moved personally from New York to Baltimore 20 years ago, and I don't regret it. Now I go to New York a lot. I got a lot of friends there, and I got my career started there. But I got a great life in Baltimore. I got my in-laws there. I have a great relationship there. My kids go to great schools. I'm a lucky guy. And so it's doable to have a great career and a great family at the same time. Now, the challenge I have goes right back to that whole, do I lose some of those soft skills, other opportunities because I'm not in the headquarters? Maybe. But I do it with you. But those are the kind of things that need to be worked through.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, Spencer, you moved to Baltimore for a girl.
I did. New York guy, married lovely young woman from Baltimore. That's my plan, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, there you go. So here's another question for you. Most people who work in Cambridge use public transportation. What about that? Will that have an impact?
Absolutely. And so I was on the phone 2 weeks ago with my head of office leasing in Houston. And one of my negatives on Houston and Texas overall was lack of trains, lack of public transportation. But now the conversation we have is, does that create a short-term, if not more durable, competitive advantage? Because you don't have to get on these trains. You don't have to cram in together. My answer is it does in the short term, but will it be durable? I question its long-term durability because I think in 18 months, people are going to be just fine getting on a subway train, an Amtrak train, or an airplane. I think in the short term, they're not. But in the short term, people don't want to get in cruise ships either. But this guy's getting on as soon as he can. So 18 months from now, I think commuting patterns will be back more to normal. I still believe in the long-term benefit of trains and planes.
This is a great question. And by the way, on that note, I have to tell you, I know in my hometown in DC, a number of companies aren't going back simply because so many of their employees take public transportation right now. But that is an important component, as many of you who are in DC know, that public transit is really important. But COVID has definitely affected their reentry because most of their teams are taking public transit.
But let's dig into that a little deeper for a second, Wendy. I was on the phone last week with Dan Shallot, who runs Starbucks in the entire tri-state region. And we were talking about, how are you doing, Mr. or Ms. Starbucks? He's like, well, our Penn Station store, which is the busiest place on the planet, is getting killed, right? Every Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, Chick-fil-A is based in a airport or a train station, and people put their office buildings next to them because it was convenient. Does that change? Is that a permanent diminution in value? Because TOD, how many people use the firm TOD? I use that every day. I think it's short term. In the short term, no, it's a big problem.
Yeah. I heard somebody lamenting that their Starbucks closed somewhere they stop every day. So this is a really good question, and a big global impact is, can you speak to the oil and energy prices and its impact on real estate and the economy? This person acknowledges prices are starting to come back, but the industry took a huge hit, especially Texas, and I will note Calgary, Edmonton. I mean, the Canadian, that's just been going on up there for a really long time. So can you talk about that from a global perspective?
Boy, you're going to hate this answer. My guest on my podcast last week was Dan Jurgen, Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Prize on exactly that issue. And so the bottom line is this. First, in the short term, the price of oil has bounced back rapidly. It's still around $40 a barrel, but it was negative $37 a barrel in March, folks. So that's a pretty big bounce back. So it's not going to be as horrendous as it could have been, but it's still going to be extremely challenging for Edmonton, for Calgary, for Brazil, for places that are almost Mexico, places that are afflicted by what's known as in the business as the, quote, the curse of oil. What is the curse of oil? It's so good when it's good that you decide not to diversify. That's why Houston's going to be more resilient this time, because they've diversified. That's why a lot of places in the Middle East tried to diversify away from oil the last few years. But in the short term, Calgary and Edmonton are going to be very, very challenged. They were challenged before this, by the way, because they never bounced back from the first fall in 2014.
Thank you. Somebody had asked the question earlier, if what your thoughts are or recommendations are for wellness in older buildings.
Yeah, so that's going to be the challenge, right? So some of them can first of all, do all of the obvious things well, right? Bring the janitorial services to the front, stage your elevator at times so that people can get in it. Do the obvious, that's called table stakes, right? That's the easy stuff. The hard stuff is the structural changes that you may need to make your building competitive, including improvements to your HVAC system. That's a more challenging question. And some of the buildings where that's a lot of money are really going to have hard questions to ask. But that's the bad news. The good news is if you go to lower Manhattan near Wall Street, 90% of those buildings that used to be office buildings are now multifamily. So there's still great use for alternative uses for older buildings that can't make that change. But most of them can, because a lot of these things like zapping your air with ultraviolet light isn't that expensive. The question is your electrical capacity to do it. So it's doable. So do the obvious things, table stakes, have a good hard conversation about the capital cost for the other.
So I want to just do this shout out that to all women on the call. Jennifer Carey, thank you. She reminds us that women comprise 50% of the population, 46% or more of the workforce, and we pay a lot of taxes. Our voices should and will be heard if we use them in conversation. Thank you, Jennifer. And Spencer, I want to get to these last couple questions because there's some doozies here that I know you're going to enjoy. Hey, have you personally experienced any decrease in your upward career mobility when you moved 20 years ago? Because it doesn't seem to have stopped you.
Well, to be direct about that answer, a little bit, okay? How about that? A little bit. There were periods of time where I did not put the word Baltimore on my business cards because I was advised not to. I was advised to put New York or Boston on them because it was considered to be negative, right? Well, I'm still happy, but yes, there was clearly some negative. And notwithstanding, I'm very proud of who I am and what I do, and I'm not in any way upset about it. I'm just saying that to some degree, to a modest degree, yes.
Yeah. Well, and New York does consider itself the center of the universe. And by the way, New York is my favorite city in the world, but I mean, that mentality, I mean, I get that. It's not right, but yes. So this is a great question. I can't wait to hear what you say. What are your thoughts on the presidential election? Potential implications for commercial real estate in the midst of COVID, in the market environment, implications for future stimulus. Like, what do you think about the election, Spencer?
Well, Wendy, we're out of time. It was good talking to you today.
Oh, no, nice try. We have about 20 minutes. Take your time.
All right. So when I answer the presidential election question, I try to answer it from a purely economic perspective. These social issues I'm not going to address, and they're very important, but that's beyond the scope of what I'm going to suggest. What I'm going to talk about is what are the implications for the economy and what are the implications for our industry. So I'll give you the very short answer first, and I will get into more detail. For purposes of this conversation, I will tell you I gave exactly the same answer in 2016, that from an economic perspective, it didn't matter that much, right? I'm going to give the same answer right now. From an economic perspective, it doesn't matter that much. But here are the factors that I'm looking at specifically. So the factors that I'm looking at are, number one, the probability of greater federal stimulus under one party or another. And quite candidly, this is a counterintuitive argument. Not counterintuitive, but I've changed my opinion on this based on the conversation I had with the president's guy last week. I think there's a greater probability of more stimulus under Biden than a Trump administration. I just do, because I think they're going to be more willing to spend on not just infrastructure, even though Trump suggested he's going to put $1 trillion in a couple of days ago. I think there's a greater probability of that. And so that's a very good thing in the short term, because I'm very much hate to use an economic guy, Keynesian guy. I spend like crazy when things are bad, and I think they're going to do that. That's the good news. The bad news is that the taxes are likely to get higher under a Biden administration than a Trump administration. And so that's just the way it is. more short-term benefit from Biden, long-term you got to worry about taxes. That's the basics of it, okay? But then when you get into the more specific of it, the Trump administration and the Biden administration have very different points of view on healthcare. They have very different points of view on oil and gas. They have very different points of view on trade. Those are the areas that you really need to dig into, because depending upon where you're located, if you're in a market that's dependent upon traditional fossil fuels, Trump administration will be better than a Biden administration. If you're a market that's more dependent upon international trade, a Biden administration is going to be better than a Trump administration. Okay, so we have all these things. It's not as easy as all good, all bad. From a federal level, Democrats likely to spend more soon, but likely to raise taxes more soon. So good soon, bad long. But from a industry perspective, that's where you need to break it down based upon your local market. As far as who's going to win, next question.
Don't make that prediction.
Next question.
Okay, great. Here's a question on the California split roll. Californians will be voting on a split roll property tax, thus creating an increase in CRE property taxes. How do you see this impacting commercial real estate overall?
Well, what's more challenging about tax increases isn't they're actually happening. It's the anticipation of whether they're going to happen or not. And I will tell you that CBRE is working on papers and other things to try to discourage people from doing that. But it's a problem because it will decrease the value of real estate. It's just math, folks. There's only so much taxes you can pass along to your tenants, and the incremental cost of doing business will shift some jobs out of state. Okay, that's just math, right? Now, do we need more tax dollars for this? Are all developers greedy Wall Street types today deserve? That's a bunch of hooey. Okay, the bottom line, and this is the one thing that everybody needs to keep in mind. Your city is immobile, but talent and money can go anywhere. And it's like a funnel. They will go to where it's most efficient. Simple as that. Next question.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to that on a lot of questions. Let's end our questions here today with a global question. And what are your thoughts on the outlook for India on corporate real estate? And is that highly linked to U.S. recovery or not so much?
India as a country has all of the demographic things going for it. It has a large, highly educated population. So it's a place that should be doing great. One of the challenges in India, and this is a funny thing to say, but it's, a lot of people study it, they have too much democracy. What does that mean? They have like 35 political parties there. Everything is very local in nature. So it's a very challenging place to do business, notwithstanding the fact that it has all of these wonderful things going for it demographically. And so I would suggest to you that the macro is very strong for India and should be. Pent up demand from consumers to spend if they can just get their act together from a micro perspective from the way they govern themselves. So I'm bullish on India, but they do have these challenges from a governance standpoint.
And the link to the U.S.?
Same thing. Look, I'm a U.S. guy that wants to sell my stuff to anybody who's willing to buy it. And I would love to open a new market with India. Now, I think the question the person's asking, which I'm tiptoeing around, is if there's some polar change in the U.S. position towards China, do we pivot towards India? To some degree, yes. Of course we do. That's geopolitics 101, and didn't help the situation that, I don't know if anybody's been reading the newspapers, but India and China just had a mini war over the weekend. Anybody see that? They really did. About 30 people got killed right at the border area. So it's a significant question. So do I see India benefiting a little bit about moving polarly away from China? To some degree, yes, but I think some of that will be impacted by the presidential election. I think more of that will happen in a Trump administration than in a Biden one, because I think Biden will probably be softer on China.
Fair enough. Thank you. So it is 11:15. I don't have any more questions at this point. I wanted to leave some time for Christine to say a few words. Spencer, I just want you to know that when I'm reading through the chat, it's so hard for me because every other word is, we love you, Spencer. We love you, Spencer. Thank you, Spencer. You're the best, Spencer. I don't want to blow your head up, but thank you. And we love having you, and your honesty and your forthcomingness is just, it's refreshing, and we just love having you. So with that, I will thank you for your time, and I will ask Christine Gorham to step up and talk about our closing our summit and this final day. And I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Spencer. As Wendy said, everybody loved you. So I think it's just nice. I think the nicest thing is you just boil things down to very simplistic terms that a lot of people can understand. So thank you for doing that for us. And again, can't say it enough. Thanks for being a member. So thanks, Spencer and Wendy. Few reminders before we all depart. Yesterday's presentations will be posted in CREWBiz next week. And we'll send you a dedicated email with all of the resources from the entire summit. Today, you'll receive an email with a link to our Leadership Summit survey. Please take a few minutes and provide your constructive feedback and help us plan for future meetings. Again, this is just, this has been a wild ride, so let us know what you think. It's been wonderful to share this new reimagined Leadership Summit virtual experience with you all. I hope to see you all at our upcoming CREW Cares leadership development sessions and webinars, and at the virtual convention for more great business networking and industry education. We've got your back. Take action. Continue to bring your A game. We build this stronger together. Think CREW first. The power of CREW. While these may just be a few words or phrases for some, to CREW Network, they are words to live by, our mission at work, our mantras. Take these words with you as we move forward together as leaders in your business and all facets of your life. Continue to stay healthy and stay connected to your CREW. Thanks so much for joining us. Talk to you soon.